and welcome to the PCOS and Nutrition podcast, Dr. Joel. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I'm really looking forward to delving into our topic today, which is on adrenal health. So we'll be covering adrenal PCOS, which is one of the PCOS types. We're covering a very popular topic, which is adrenal fatigue and how to heal the adrenals. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to come onto the podcast. But before we delve into what the adrenals are and what their purpose is, can you briefly talk about your story and how and why you decided to raise awareness and educate people on adrenal health?
Sure. Well, probably much like you, Desmina, when you have a show on PCOS health, then there's a chance that you've been a direct user sort of the experience, right? Same thing for me. So I had just graduated with my chiropractic doctorate, and I had over $200,000 worth of student loans. I was studying abroad because I grew up in Canada, and my wife was pregnant with twins. And so I was just overwhelmed and burnt out. And here I was just starting my career, and I injured my back, and I was exhausted and burnt out. And I had a acupuncturist for a patient come in and bring me a book that was entitled, "Why Do I Still Have Thyroid Symptoms Even Though My Lab Tests Are Normal?" And I thought, I don't have thyroid problems. So I let the book sit on my shelf for a couple months, and I even think like almost a year now. And anyways, it finally gathered me towards it, and I started reading it. And there was a section on there on adrenal fatigue, and I had never heard of it, and I had been studied pretty well. I had a degree in exercise physiology. I had a second degree in psychology, and I had my doctorate in chiropractic, and I'd never heard of this. So that's really what started the awareness into what this all was about. And ever since then, that's been my mission. Because if I thought, if I have this and I've never heard about it, what about all the other people that have this and have never heard about it? And it's like a pandemic in terms of how we live a fast-paced life, and stress and demands and multiple windows open. In terms of the analogy, like on the computer, we are juggling so many responsibilities that we ultimately tap into our reserves, and that causes us to not maintain a proper homeostatic balance in our body. And next thing you know, we run on fumes, and then your doctor tells you there's no such thing as an adrenal fatigue problem. So there's a lot of interesting what have yous in the entire story of all of this.
I think a lot of people can definitely relate to your story, because I think, like you said, we always go, and we don't realize until we come into that situation where we fall ill, and then you realize that all this constant energy we're putting in and not actually taking a step back and trying to actually recover and heal, that, we come to realize it's really important to actually stop and just try and relax and actually listen to your body. I think we're not in tune with our body anymore. We're constantly trying to fight it and say, even when we are tired and we can't go anymore, we think, we should be going on all the time, because we see people online saying, you got to grind and hustle, you got to be up till 5 o'clock in the morning working. And then you're just like, well, when do you actually sleep and let your body charge? There's so much conflicting information, and we should just really be in tune with our body and not constantly comparing ourselves and looking at people online. So when the fight or flight response obviously raises, the cortisol and the blood sugar goes up to give you that energy to, whatever situation you are in, to survive. And that's, I guess, when you're constantly in that high level of stress and blood sugar is always high, then that's obviously not good for, it could possibly lead to insulin resistance, which is another kind of condition that a lot of women with PCOS suffer from as well. So I guess it's good that we covered the basics of what it is. So what is the link between the adrenals and PCOS? How does this happen? How does a woman with PCOS have adrenal PCOS? What's the cause?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Despina, when the body has that communication where the brain senses the stress in the body and it signals through the hypothalamus and the pituitary for the adrenals to secrete their hormones. What happens ultimately, like you mentioned, is there's adaptive responses. And when your body's under siege, it prioritizes what it does. So in a lot of instances, I know you've asked me about an adrenal type of PCOS versus an insulin type of PCOS. I got to tell you, I don't know if I would, I think that insulin is involved and adrenals are involved in both. And I think really what happens is when you have a heightened stress response, there's a lot of stimulation from the brain to the adrenals to secrete its hormones, and you have different areas of the adrenals that when they get that message, they secrete a different hormone. So there's one zone that will secrete your mineralocorticoids, one zone that secretes your cortisol, your glucocorticoids, and then one that secretes your sex steroids or your sex hormones. And so what happens is with repeated stressors over and over and over again, you have all zones are active, and you have very high levels of androgens or DHEA that turns into androgens or testosterone or metabolites of androgens. And that's where you typically see women that have these stress responses. They have the polycystic ovarian syndrome. And the interesting thing, I was just actually reading about this so that I can give some more value to your listeners, is the 3 criteria that you need to have is you need to have a regular cycle, so short, not there, too long, erratic. You need to have the androgen excess, so that's where you have the testosterones or the DHEA or the metabolites, and then you have polycystic ovaries. So you have to have 2 of the 3 there. So interesting in terms of the definition. And that's what I think the mistake is a lot of the times in the health world, is if you go by black and white definitions of things, like, oh, I'm not going to listen to you. There's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. You can't be tired. You can't be exhausted. You can't have other things that are breaking down because you're going by the book and you're saying that it's this. So I'm just going to throw you out because that doesn't make sense. That's where we need to really come to terms with, okay, let me listen to what's going on. Even if they defined it wrong, it's still legitimate. And the same thing with the PCOS is you don't have to have multiple cysts for it to be a PCOS-like symptom. So I think it's a bad definition of a condition, and it should really be maladaptive stress response producing excess androgens and ultimately impacting hormonal cycles. And there can be components of polycystic ovaries, but there may not be. And then the link to that with the insulin, just to kind of allow the listeners to know, insulin and cortisol dance around. They have this interesting relationship where I tell people low glucose hypoglycemia or reactive hypoglycemia leads to the same road of high glucose, which they both create insulin resistance. It just takes a little bit longer for the hypoglycemics to get there. And the reason that is because when they're secreting a lot of cortisol, it's because they're stressed and maybe their glucose levels go really low. And when their glucose levels go really low, the body says, hey, this is a stress state. It makes cortisol. It breaks down glucose, goes into the bloodstream. And then insulin rises because it has to pump it out of the bloodstream into the cell. So insulin and cortisol dance around. And that's why I don't think purely there's ever not a insulin-based PCOS-like problem, because if it's adrenal based, it implies a relationship with insulin anyways. It just may not be the typical obese, overweight, insulin based problem, but indirectly insulin is involved, whether it's primarily, it's kind of like a chicken or the egg. And that's a run-on answer. I don't know if that answers what you asked me to answer.
Yeah, like you said, you don't have to have the cysts on your ovaries, and you can be lean and be insulin resistant. So it's always difficult to kind of say, oh, it's this kind of thing, until you really delve in and get the test results done to check your hormones. But it's never a clear thing. that's the thing. We have to change the name about PCOS. Is you don't have to have the cyst, which is, you know, they have to change that. But yeah. So that was a good. Thank you for explaining that, and I think our listeners have, understood more about the connection and that you could have insulin resistance and adrenal PCOS because there's the connection between them two. So what what are some of the symptoms of having something wrong with your adrenals? What could people be looking out for?
So they don't handle stress the same way. They're not maintaining their internal environment, their homeostatic, regulatory, I guess, the scenes behind the scenes. So their blood pressure, their heart rate, their temperature, their respiratory rate, those are all autonomic nervous system functions to maintain a certain level of homeostasis. So fundamentally, we see that go where they can have panic, anxiety, heart racing, adrenaline surges without being able to, handle the stressor the same way. So it's not a commensurate equal value of you had a stressor and now you have this overblown reactivity to stress. That's a good sign. Another sign is the circadian rhythm breaks down. So crashing in the middle of the day, after lunch, reactive hypoglycemia, feeling shaky, lightheaded, and jittery when you don't eat and feeling energized when you do eat, or crashing after a meal. There's always those glucose levels and feeling tired in the morning and then more alert and ready to go at night. And then brain fog, focus, concentration. Those are some of the, and then sex hormones, libido and drive and mood. And those are sort of an umbrella symptomatology of all the things that you would see if I were to work up someone and understand that, hey, there's a stress-related component here. And these are all the things that we're going to see in this. It's a widespread problem.
Mm. And some of, obviously, the cause is the stress, but it's not always the stress of, the emotional stress or going to work and being stressed or relationship kind of stress. What other kind of stresses are there that could cause adrenal problems?
Yeah, I mean, just environmental stress, right? I mean, we pretty much have this environment that it's the best of times and worst of times, right? And we have chemicals and we have pollutants and we have heavy metals, we have pathogens. So, viruses and bacterias and molds and candidas and yeast and nanobacterias. And there's all of these things. And then, of course, the foods, right? Unfortunately, the proteins in foods, they can stimulate an immune response if you have a reactivity to those as well. And so I look at it as it's so multifaceted, Despina. You have physical stress, emotional stress, chemical stress, pathogenic stress. All of that has to be assimilated in the body for the body to maintain its regulatory mechanisms. And when it's overwhelming the body, then that's where that stress response system starts to break down.
Mm. And there's also when a lot of people and women who are doing these low calorie diets and over exercising, that could be attributed to problems with your adrenals too, right?
Yeah, it's a chicken or an egg phenomena, right? Because that in and of itself is a stressor that your body's not getting enough fuel, right? And then it can also be a consequence too, where it's a cause and an effect, for sure.
Yeah, because this is great. It's just the fact that when people don't realize that you have to take a break from exercise, you can't be constantly going, go, go, go. You have to let your body recover. Important to get the message out there that it can affect your adrenals and it's still a stressor at the end of the day. So what kind of tests would you recommend a woman to get done to find out if she has something wrong with her adrenals?
Sure. So I like as many testing mediums that you can use. So blood is great. I mean, you're going to look at the bound component of the hormone, meaning it's bound to a protein. You could do a free fraction in the blood. Doctors don't order it. It's a little more expensive and obscure, but that's a starting point to give us absolute numbers. Not just cortisol, and cortisol, I would say not for cortisol per se. It's a good starting point to do maybe when you first wake up to get a blood draw if you were, not at any other time of the day because that's where it would be the highest. But it's just an absolute. You're seeing a relative value. Plus you're looking at your other sex hormones and estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. You can look at prolactin. Those are other good values. But then I also like to look at urine. And it's not the total 24-hour urine collection because you don't see the circadian rhythm in there. We do it at certain times of the day so you can get and track for the amounts of cortisol that were released at that time. A lot of research shows that that's not valid, but it's because it's new and they have new tests out there. And I've done hundreds of them, and I do see that it correlates really nicely to the circadian rhythm. And then if you can have a saliva sample, that's the free fraction of the hormone, and that correlates really nicely with the circadian rhythm. So when you have more data, I always say when you look at an x-ray, you don't want to just look at one view and say, okay, I don't see the crack in the bone. Because it wasn't viewable on that particular image. So that's what I say. The same thing with the adrenals. If you can get blood tests, if you can get urine tests, if you can get saliva tests, those are going to be helpful to actually see, what's bound to a protein, what's free, what's being metabolized, and then that way you can really get lots of information there.
Interesting. And so women, if they're going for the PCOS, would they be expecting high DHEAS for, obviously that's like the male hormone, right? So that would be elevated.
It can be, you would see high androgens, so it doesn't necessarily have to be DHEAS. The DHEAS and the DHEA, I think, predominantly are produced in the adrenals, and you will typically see that. But I've seen instances where DHEAS is low, but the ovaries produce the androgens like the testosterone and the androstenedione. And so you would see some of that in there, but more often than not, yes, you will see the DHEA and the DHEASs be high, but inflammation, if it's driving the PCOS-like symptoms, can cause a reduction in the DHEA, and but you're still seeing the androgenicity, and that's where the way that the metabolites break down are going down more of an androgen pathway, and that's called 5-alpha. And you don't see that on a blood test, you see that on a urine test. You can actually see that 5-alpha, it's like basically going down a railroad track, and can it go to the left or can it go to the right? When we have stressors that are prolonged, it goes to the right, and it makes it more androgenic, and that's where you'll see like more irritability and rage and oily skin and unwanted hair growth, and maybe even male pattern baldness or loss of hair, abnormal cycles, and then maybe polycystic ovaries.
Interesting. So one of the common tests that doctors recommend is like the Dutch test, right? That's a urine one. So people can
Yes.
get that done.
Yeah, the Dutch test is great. I just had a consult yesterday with someone, and she has PCOS-like symptoms, and the doctors told her that everything looks fine. And then when we look at that, we see so many more telltale signs when we look at her metabolites. Like she actually was aromatizing, which means if you produce a lot of androgens, and there's the same reasons you produce that because the stress will cause those androgens to spill over into estrogens, and then that can mess up clearance as well. But you wouldn't necessarily see that on a saliva sample or a blood sample. You would maybe see higher estrogens. But when you have more data, you can make more conclusions.
Because there's just so many hormones and so many different things going on in the body that this kind of test really looks at the whole kind of picture rather than, you know, one thing that, like you said, doesn't give you the whole picture. I gave the example of the X-ray. You have to look at different sides of the problem. So I think that's very interesting and a good way to do it. So how can someone go about healing their adrenals, you know, treating their problem? What kind of things would they need to do? For example, with their nutrition, is there a specific thing that need to eat more of or avoid, or what do you recommend?
Well, good question. Everyone's unique, but I think we have to identify our stressors, right? What are the things that we do every day? And a lot of people will want me to review their blood work and their test results, and I want to know about their life. Like, tell me like what you do, tell me about your relationships, tell me where you live, you know, tell me about those things. What's your schedule? Are you on a third shift? You know, what time do you go to bed? When do you eat? Because ultimately that comes down to being vigilant about your circadian rhythm and understanding your sleep-wake cycles, understanding your exposure to sunlight and darkness, and what time you're eating your meals. Those are very, very key. And I would tell people, like, we are engineered for 2.5 million years to live on a circadian rhythm, not with a light bulb and not with an internet, not with, you know, an iPhone. And so if we can get back to basics, this being in terms of, okay, I like the idea of when it's light out, we get light. When it's dark out, we get dark. And we keep that pattern as consistent as possible. I do like the idea of diet variation, not so much one specific diet. I think that's how we were engineered, with depending feast and famines, times of the year, regions of the lands. All of those things are how we're somewhat programmed our body, and being able to, depending on your schedules and your stressors and all of that stuff, really being flexible with the diet. I like the concept of a 12-hour fast from the night before to the next day. I think that's legitimate. Hydration is really important. And then it comes down to certain foods that people don't process as well as other foods, like grains. Some people have high histamines, and that could be a concern, or some people have higher oxalates, and that can be a concern, or some people have GI disturbances and overgrowth of bacteria, and that's where it becomes very problematic. So it's like, okay, I heard with this diet I can't have that, but in this diet I shouldn't have this, but you know, they're contradicting, so which one do I do? And I try not to get too sophisticated in that way. Keep it simple first, and can have a healthy amounts of protein, carbs, and fats, and then from there, see what you feel better with. And that's like a longer answer, but yeah, I think it's just simplicity is getting that circadian rhythm handled, and then of course the last answer I would say is just your perception of all that stuff. Because if you have a everything is terrible mentality, it is terrible. And I think that goes a long way to help heal the adrenals, is how we perceive our life versus, you know, what it really is.
I definitely agree. And I think the thing that you mentioned about how your diet should be more, you know, keep it simple. I think going back to basics is definitely where we should start. Because I think we're so consumed with need to follow this diet. This diet has been shown to be the best diet, or I think we really need to just focus on the main macronutrients of fat, carbs, protein, and just go from there rather than just overcomplicating things. And I think one of the other things that you kind of mentioned, a 12-hour fast, which is like 10 to 12 hours at the minimum you should fast, which is really easy if you're getting like the minimum of 7 hours sleep, for example. But intermittent fasting is really popular in the PCOS community. So is intermittent fasting like a no-go, like that kind of really long fast? Would you say it's like a no-go for people who suffer from adrenal PCOS and adrenal fatigue?
So it's a controversial subject, and you know, with my there's a guy in UK. His name is Alessandro Ferretti, and he's an Italian guy who does a lot of research. And I went to see him lecture, and, he said, how many out there put up their hands if you went through like an exercise physiology program and you were always told to have small meals more frequently? And while that can be good in the beginning stages of someone who's reactive hypoglycemic, like the typical teenager that misses the breakfast and has a very high carb meal and then has lots of hours between the next time that they eat and then the next time that they eat, they are typically going to be reactive hypoglycemic, and their glucose levels are going to be lower, and they're going to want to have smaller meals frequently so that they don't allow that to fall too quickly. But my feeling is that over time, like I said, that high road of high glucose and that low road of low glucose lead to the same road of insulin resistance. I want someone to prove it to me that they actually have low glucose, and do like a glucose monitor and see if it's actually falling, versus I feel reactive hypoglycemic. If I don't eat, I'm going to faint. They take their glucose levels and their millimoles are high. And they're in a heightened glucose state. So I think it's easier said than done. I don't think that having small meals more frequently is beneficial over a longer term, because you're going to keep that glucose levels always elevated and insulin levels always elevated. But I like the idea of a good combination of putting logs on the fire, which is protein and fats, versus just kindling on the fire, which is carbs. So that way you have more a more delayed extended life of that fuel source, so you don't need to have those multiple meals more frequently. So I think it's one of those things where you need to work with someone to understand your unique nuances, but I don't like the idea of just saying, okay, you have adrenal problems, you need small meals more frequently, when depending on how long they've had it before, they're very metabolically resistant and their glucose levels and their insulin levels are high. I don't think that's a wise decision to do that for someone who is in that state versus the earlier states. Now, a lot of younger, women, maybe in their teens or early 20s, may benefit from that because they are younger and it hasn't been going on as long, and it is really reactive hypoglycemia. But that's where you just can't conclude and say, okay, everyone has to do this or everyone has to do that.
I guess that's why when you creating your own treatment plan, it really has to be personalized and specific to your hormonal status and your lifestyle, rather than just seeing, oh, intermittent fasting's great for this, I'm just going to follow it as well. And even if you do decide to follow it, like you said, work with a professional so they can keep an eye on your hormonal levels, so they can adjust certain things. And if it works, awesome. If it doesn't, it's not because a lot of people will be like, oh, this doesn't work for me, that means it's my fault. But it's never the person's fault. It's just it's not suitable for you. We're all different. So what works for one person won't work for you, and that's fine. It doesn't mean you're broken.
Right.
So we touched on some of the nutritional aspects. Are there any, this is a topic that is, everyone's like, supplements, but is there any supplements you would say someone with adrenal problems might need, or what's your stance on supplements?
Sure. So yeah, I do prioritize them in terms of systems. Like if that person has massive inflammation, right? I like the idea of plant-based omegas, parent 3s and parent 6s. I'll give you an example though, to sort of switch the question a little bit with the female that I had in the office the other day, where we went through her Dutch test, and she had massive amounts of aromatization. And she also had the upregulation of that 5-alpha. And then she was really, really slow on her clearance in phase 2 with her estrogen. So I want to micromanage that. I want to lower her inflammation. I want to stabilize her glucose. I want to be able to clear out those estrogens in phase 1 and phase 2, but probably phase 2 first. I use the example of phase 1 is bringing the garbage to the curb, and phase 2 is having the garbage men take it away. So I want to make sure that if I'm going to be bringing more garbage to the curb, that I have the garbage men working faster. So that's phase 2. So that's typically B vitamins, and it doesn't have to be methylated, B12 or methylfolate. They could be good, healthy foods, right? You get that in your fibers and so forth. But then I like the idea of supporting those methylation pathways. And then that's where we can bring in the support for clearing out estrogens. Some people don't like them if in the PCOS community. I was just talking to someone the other day, and they said it did terrible for them because it's a aromatase blocker, and it caused their testosterone levels to go higher. And that might be true, but I think what happened was their phase 2 was so slow that they pushed the clearance of estrogen in phase 1 so much that they had all these partially metabolized estrogens that were hanging out, not going anywhere. So to answer your question, I like the idea of the DIM or the I3C is a good nutrient for phase 1. Phase 2 is methylation, stuff like B vitamins or phospholipids, choline, creatine. Those are all pay the bills for methylation to be able to clear out those estrogens quicker. Going down a 5-alpha pathway, going to more 5-beta, we look at chrycine and zinc and sal palmetto. Those will get you into that area there. And then for adrenals, depending on where they are, if they're completely flatlined, maybe we're looking at some licorice root if they have low blood pressure and they're putting cortisone into more active use, meaning you have the ability to go from cortisol to cortisone or cortisone to cortisol. And I see people that have really high cortisone, inactive hormones, and if you give them licorice root, it can push them down the active, and it's not really changing anything except making it more active. So yeah, there's lots of ways you can do it. You just, again, like you said, you want to know specifically what is this person dealing with and how can I customize it to their specific needs so I give them the most bang for their dollar with the nutrients that we're recommending.
Interesting. And I like the analogy you gave with the detoxification with the garbage. I think a lot of, you want to obviously help with the removal of toxins, but obviously you don't want that build up, which will end up, creating more problems. So I think that analogy was pretty good. And another thing, you mentioned creatine. I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they'll be like, oh, I thought that was just for bodybuilders or people into fitness.
Right. Yeah. Or it's bad for your kidneys.
Yeah.
And, it's a really great end product for methylation where we don't like to necessarily give you too many substrates in the assembly line to that could break down and cause more problems. So when you pay the bills and phospholipids, choline, carnitine, creatine, those are all end products of methylation where it allows your body to catch up with the delayed assembly line that they have if nothing's been fixed. And 5 grams per day, keeping hydration levels high and having a blood test to see the creatinine levels are actually low. You'll see that with people actually is that their creatinine levels are super low. And then you can definitely go forward with that and support their energy pathways. And now all of a sudden, other things start to feel better too, like clearing out their estrogens.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So one other big thing people are going to be wondering is exercise, because obviously if you're experiencing really bad fatigue, and everyone's going to be like, I can't physically get out of bed, I can't physically go for a run. What is your opinion? Do people try and exercise? Do they just say, yeah, I can't do it, I'm just going to give up and just do nothing? What's your opinion?
Yeah, it's a good question, because at the fundamental cellular level, when the stress has been going on for so long, it just goes so much deeper than the adrenals. It goes right down to the mitochondrial level where they're not breathing at the respiratory level effectively. So they're not bringing oxygen in, they're not making ATP, and that wouldn't be a wise thing to do in that state. But I like the idea of getting sunlight, getting that circadian rhythm going, getting fresh air, getting outside, getting moving, and doing whatever relative to you. I don't like the idea of high intensity if you're exhausted and burnt out. But I do like the idea if you don't have a cortisol awakening response where your cortisol, doubles within the first half hour, maybe doing something a little bit more moving in that first little bit when waking up to give it a little bit of a resurrection and build it up a little bit. So I think they have to just listen to their body, like you said earlier, Despina, where you are a good listener to your body and you don't be completely idle and do nothing. But at the same time, and that's the theme of this interview, is really living under that bell-shaped curve of, not too little, not too much, but just right. And slowly but surely push it to where you're doing a little bit more each day. And if you feel tired, if we had like a little battery sensor that said, okay, today you need to rest, and then today you need to push it, then we would have more feedback. And I think that's the dynamic nature of your body. But ultimately, again, there's no formula to say, okay, you can't do anything or you should do a lot of things. You have to listen to your body and do a little bit of both depending on where you are in that bell-shaped curve.
I think that's a good answer, and I agree. I think you shouldn't not try and do anything because you're suffering from that fatigue. I think we all get to the point where we feel really exhausted, but I think if this kind of a prolonged thing, I don't think not doing anything's really gonna help. I think doing even some kind of movement, some walking, just something really low intensity, just to help your body get that energy, that oxygen, just to slowly every day, just kind of week by week increase it, just so your body realizes and just starts to heal itself. I think, yeah, like you said, it just needs to be day by day, take it easy, listen to your body, and just work with that at the end of the day. But yeah, I think that was a really great interview. But is there anything like a last bit of advice or a tip you would recommend and say to our listeners?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people don't keep hydrated enough because they do use these stimulants and caffeine, and then they're not keeping hydrated enough with their day-to-day activity levels, and that will drain the adrenals quicker than anything, and they become depleted because the stress levels causes them to remove and lose more minerals and electrolytes. So, salting water can be very therapeutic. And keeping, in the U.S. we do the old, imperial system. So we don't use, I used to know it when I grew up in Canada, but now I've, forgotten it, but usually half the body weight in ounces. So if you weigh pounds, that's pounds. So if someone weighs, 150 pounds, and you're really looking to do half your body weight, so 75 ounces. But the real trick is to make it so that if you drink any caffeine or any stimulants, that you got to make up for that about 32 ounces for every 8 ounces of caffeine that you have. So that's a lot, right? Because if you have 2 cups of coffee before 10 o'clock, that's an extra 64 ounces. And if you weigh 150, that's 75. And that's where people are walking around dehydrated half the time, and they mistake that for hunger and sweets and yada, yada,
So on the topic of caffeine, is this, because a lot of people be like, just avoid it. Is it still something you could have, but you just gotta drink a lot of water? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, depends, because that whole pathway for breaking down your stimulants is going to be feeding more of that in there, and I'm not really crazy about that either. So as much as we possibly can, I don't want someone to be on caffeine, but it's not going to be cold turkey, right? It's going to be something that we negotiate and work to really get them hydrated so that brings up their energy levels versus a fool's gold of caffeine that's ultimately making them worse than better.
Awesome. So thank you so much. How can our listeners connect with you?
Sure. So thank you. I just created my website. It's thetruthaboutadrenalfatigue.com. I have my YouTube channel. It's called Your Adrenal Fix. And then Facebook, there's a group called Dr. Joel Rosen's The Truth About Adrenal Fatigue. And then Instagram, it's Dr._Joel_Rosen. I don't know why I did the underscores, but yeah, those are all the places that they can get in contact with me.
Awesome. I'll have everything linked in the show notes. Highly recommend that you check Dr. Joel out, give him a follow. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come onto the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about their adrenals, how to heal it, and just take care of their body overall. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it.